All right, so you should be able to hear me now. Let me know in the chat section. Can you hear me? All right, so welcome to the live stream today. Everything seems to be working properly now by God's grace. I'm your host, Israel. What we do here is help you avoid deception, learn the Bible for yourself. Today is live Q&A, Bible Q&A. Feel free to ask a question, one question at a time. No unnecessary big words unless necessary. You can, and this is really significant, ladies and gentlemen, draw my attention. You can super chat, you can and or mention me in that word if you really want me to see it. That doesn't guarantee I'll see it, but that's obviously going to give you the best opportunity for that to actually happen. You should be able to hear me, you should be able to see everything properly. One question to start, and then ultimately after that I'm open to any questions if there are questions. If not, I'll shut it down. And ultimately the reason I said before about mentioning me, right, because the question I'm actually going to start with ultimately today was a question I actually didn't see until after the live stream. So again, if you want me to see your question and at least consider answering the question, make sure you mention me in the comment section, in the chat section, sorry. So today's question, Ikosmia says, nicely put it for me to actually answer. This was a question, like I said. So today's question was from jdaniel, and this was his question. What are your opinions on usury? The Old Testament and the Torah, etc., make it forbidden to charge usury to other Jews. Today we're under major usury. Are you okay with living under these usury systems? And I think if I remember correctly, he said something, he's interested in my thoughts. Cool. So usury is a really interesting subject. jdaniel has already given us some insights. What I want to do to start off the session is basically start with, I broke it down into kind of 5 things. I want to first talk about what usury actually is, right? Just so those of us who are not familiar with that kind of language know exactly what that is. I want to basically give God's view on it. Ultimately, we'll look at some scriptural examples. I basically want to highlight as well some key figures in the Bible, how they basically reference usury, etc. Then I want to talk about more specifically what jdaniel was asking me specifically about right now. Are we under a major usury in the world today? And ultimately, I want to wrap up this question with just some final thoughts that I think will be very beneficial. So again, if you have a question on anything Bible related that you are interested in finding out an answer to, feel free to put in the chat section. Hopefully by God's grace, I'll be able to answer the question for you. Cool. So first things first, what is usury? Well, just to kind of simplify this for a lot of just the more modern audience, right, who are not familiar with that kind of term, we can liken it. There's kind of 2 definitions when you really think about this. We would liken it today as sort of like an interest, right? If you think about the thumbnail of the video, it's about interest. So you basically make a payment or you borrow money, right? And there's an interest payment to basically pay back. So when you think about this question, that is basically like the broad, like the basic meaning, right? You charge interest on a payment, on a borrowed good, etc. Another one, which we will see in a moment when we start to go through the scriptures, which you can kind of take from this kind of definition as well, is not just necessarily taking interest, but more so like this excessive amount of interest where you're basically turning it into like high rate extortion ultimately. So those are the 2 kind of definitions. So first things first, in regards to answering jdaniel's question, I want to go to some scriptural examples. So not only do I give you like a basic understanding, I'll give you obviously scriptural examples to kind of whet your appetite. The first one I want to go to, and I remember I said I want to give you God's view on this, right, with scriptural examples. So I want to first take you to the book of Exodus, and I think this will be a good one for a couple of reasons. Let's basically go there now. Give me 2 seconds. All right, cool. So you should be able to see the scriptures. The first example is in Exodus, right? And what does it say? It says, if thou lend money to my people poor by thee, what should you do? Thou shalt not be to him as an usurer, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury. Right? So very simple, very concise. God is basically saying here, look, don't borrow to your brothers, fellow Israelites, under the guise of taking back some sort of interest payment, right? That's the first example. So that's very nice and cut and dry, right? Now let's look at another example. We'll work through a couple of the books in the Torah. Let's go to Leviticus. And this is another interesting one, as you'll see in a moment. Give me 2 seconds. All right, so let's take a look at this one right here. So this is now Leviticus. And again, this is God's laws being passed on to the people. And he says, and if thy brother, that's a key word as well, be waxen poor. So it's basically just a cross-reference to what we just kind of covered, but it gives an additional bit of insight here, because it talks about if they're poor, then thou shalt do what? Relieve him, right? A stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with thee. Now, some people may think, or I'll even leave that for now, right? So then he says, take thou no usury of him or increased, but fear thy God, that thy brother may live with thee, right? So the concept here that God is basically, giving the people at this point is, if you are going to lend to one of, like, a fellow Israelite who's ultimately fallen into poverty, don't basically now try and borrow them money or goods or whatever it is, any sort of service, with the intention to now try and receive back from them, and especially not in an extortionate way, right? Hopefully this is making sense. And even one more thing I'll show you, right? We can even read this from this piece of text as well, which I think is actually quite interesting. This is the next line. Thou shalt not give him thy money upon usury, nor lend him thy victuals for increase, right? So I know I've already talked about both scenarios. I've talked about how you can lend money, but you can also lend goods. Exodus and Leviticus, up until this point, 2 books, the second and third book in the Bible, right, have basically given us an example. Now, Daniel kind of alluded to this already, but I think this is, like, I'll bring this up as well, right? In the midst of what he was basically saying. Now, the thing that's actually key is what you find just from a plain reading in the Bible is this particular stipulation was only for fellow Israelites, right? So this wasn't necessarily something that you would do for other nations. I'll talk about at least one reason why that actually may happen and why that actually may be a good thing. Let's go to Deuteronomy. And this is, again, the third example. So we've gone from Exodus to Leviticus and then Deuteronomy. So we've skipped the book of Numbers. Now we're in the final book of the Torah in regards to the books of Moses. Now he says, thou shalt not lend upon usury to thy brother, same as before, usury of money, usury of victual, same as Leviticus. And this goes even further now, usury of anything that is lent upon usury. So look, any scenario where you have this sort of interest payment, this is forbidden. Don't do this to your fellow Israelites. Don't do it at all. Then he says, unto a stranger, so someone who's not an Israelite, thou mayest lend upon usury. So you can lend out of interest to someone else, but not to your fellow citizen Israelite. But unto thy brother, thou shalt not lend upon usury, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all that thou settest thine hand to in the land whither thou goest to possess it. So this is ultimately about what? Going into the new land, and God is basically instilling in them 3 times at least, when your brother is poor, when a fellow Israelite is poor, basically take care of them, right? Look after them, and don't try and basically get any interest off them. Don't try and profit from them. But in this final example, he qualifies it and says, or makes it even more direct here, and he says, look, you can exact interest from a stranger, but not from a fellow Israelite. Now, I was thinking about this, like, one thing I'll say in regards to the scenario, why would it be for the Israelite, not for the stranger? One thing I would say, just thinking about this, just from I feel like from a basic standpoint, is if you were a stranger, you potentially were not obviously following, right, the Israelite way, right? And really and truly, that could be a loophole in a way in which a stranger can now come and basically borrow money, borrow something from an Israelite as a way to basically gain ground and ultimately try and take over the country. So that is at least one reason why it would make sense for God to basically put this stipulation as to not doing this to other nations who necessarily don't follow the laws of the Israelite, etc. We also know that obviously if a stranger was obviously coming into Israel and ultimately was taken on the customs, things most likely would be different, right? So this is 3 examples from the Bible, kind of just outlaying God's perspective on usury. Now I want to give you a couple of examples of people in the scripture and how they basically classify it. Because yes, we can see from what God is saying, his kind of view, but now let's actually see this in action. So the first example I want to give you is from the book of Jeremiah, one of the most famous prophets in the whole of the Bible, obviously especially in the Old Testament. And what does he say? He said something really interesting, and I all of these examples I'm going to give you 3 examples, and all of them are interesting in their own right. And I definitely recommend, as always, as is my custom, right, go and search these things out, read these things in more context at some point in the future, right? So this is from the book of Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, and what does he say? God here is ultimately telling Jeremiah judgment is coming. And look what Jeremiah says here, which is actually quite interesting. So after God has basically said, look, judgment is coming, right? This is what Jeremiah says. He says, woe is me. So like he's in trouble ultimately. Why? My mother, that thou hast borne me a man of strife and a man of contention to the whole earth. If you don't know, just to give you a little bit, if you don't know, just to give you a little bit of context, Jeremiah went around preaching a hard message for the Israelites. And what does he say? So he's basically saying, look, he's like this troublesome guy because he's going around, he uses the terminology, the whole earth, but really he's just talking about Israel, right? And what does he say? I have neither lent on usury, so I haven't done this, nor men have lent to me on usury. Every one of them doth curse me. So what is Jeremiah saying there? So what's Jeremiah saying there? Jeremiah is basically saying, look, I'm the one that's delivering all of this bad news because of the wickedness that's around me. And because I'm delivering this bad news, I'm seen as this bad guy that's ultimately, and people are cursing me. But look at Jeremiah's defense. He uses the example, this is why I brought it up. He used the example of basically taking and giving interest. I'm not even one of those guys who's basically giving out with interest or taking back with interest, etc. So the reason I brought up this particular example in regards to this context, the reason I brought it up in regards to this particular context is because it's highlighting Jeremiah's view of giving with interest. By what he's saying is giving us insights as to the mindset of the people at the day. Giving upon usury or taking interest or even giving interest to someone was seen as something very negative. The next example I want to give you is also another interesting one. You get a couple of examples in this whole scenario, right? But I want to just, again, you're going to have to read this stuff in your own time to kind of get the flavor, right, in a lot of detail. We've looked at Jeremiah. Now we're looking at Ezekiel, another famous prophet in the Old Testament. Again, similar fashion to Jeremiah. This is sometime further in the future now, in timeline-wise perspective. And God is now saying to Ezekiel, the next man of God, look, talk to the Israelites and say this. So he now starts talking. God says, look, I'm going to start judging people differently. And now he's talking about someone particularly, and he says, look, he hath not given forth upon usury, so he hasn't given with interest, neither has he taken any increase. So the person that is doing this, that basically listening to what God says, what does God say? He says, this kind of person has walked in his statutes, has kept his judgments to deal truly. He is just, he shall surely live, saith the Lord God. He goes further. When you scroll down, he now changes it. The person who doesn't do these things, who's not obedient, who's not listening to what I'm saying, what does he say? This person, and notice he mentions a couple of different things, but he gives this particular example that we're talking about in regards to interest, right? He says, hath given forth upon usury, so he's given with interest in return in his mind, and hath taken increase. Then what does God say? Shall he then live? So the person that's doing all of these different abominations, this particular example as well, what does God say? This person should not live. He have done all these, and God calls these abominations. So we can see this is very significant. One more example here as well, right? This is another example. The person who has taken off his hand from the poor and has not received usury, okay, this is the third example here. He shall not die for the iniquity of his father. Again, read all this stuff in your own time in more context, but you can see so far from God's judgments in the law that was given to Moses, and then based on some of the most devout men of God that we've looked at so far, Jeremiah and Ezekiel. I'll give you one more example in Ezekiel as well. We're seeing God's perspective. So we not only saw the judgment, now we're seeing his perspective. One more example I'll give you, right, is just a little further in Ezekiel. And what does he say? So here he says, in thee have they taken gifts to shed blood. He's now pronouncing judgment, more judgment on Israel. And he says, in thee have they taken gifts to shed blood. Thou hast taken usury and increase. So you're doing this stuff. And thou hast greedily gained of thy neighbors by extortion. If you remember back to the two definitions that I gave you, the second definition was one of what? Of a sort of extortion. And there's scriptures like this that will basically lend people to this kind of deeper definition of what this whole interest taking, interest giving scenario actually is. And what does he say? The person that's doing this has forgotten him, right? And then ultimately God again is just going to go into a lot of judgment, right? So last example, since I've spent a bit of time, I won't go into this in much detail, even though this may even be my favorite example out of all of them, right? Read this account in your own time. This is again in the book of Nehemiah. Now a bit further. This is another practical example, not like Ezekiel where God is speaking, or Jeremiah where Jeremiah is speaking about this activity. This is a real life scenario activity in the Bible when this was actually happening. And Nehemiah is a powerful book. He's a very stern and tough guy. And in this particular scenario, I'm not going to, like I said, spend too much time on it. Read this in your own time. It's a really great read. Right? He's basically talking about these people, the Israelites, that were basically taking part in this interest with fellow Israelites. And he basically, just to kind of give you a little bit of flavor, right? What does he say? He was angry, and what did he do? He started thinking about it, and then he rebuked them and said, look, right? Basically let them go. And what does he say? Where is it? He says, so he's petitioning them, restore, give back, basically, I pray you to them, even this day, their lands, their vineyards, their olive yards, and their houses, and also money, and corn and wine, and the oil that you exact of them. So basically drop the tax. All these taxes you've basically put on them, drop them, don't continue to do them, right? And what did they say? They said they will restore. So they basically, in the narrative, basically go on and basically make a pact and say, yep, we are basically going to give this up. So those are definitions of what usury actually is, or interest, if you want to say it, based on just modern vernacular. We've given you examples about what God basically says in regards to the commandment of basically taking or lending, or taking or giving. We've looked at a couple of examples, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Nehemiah. Again, go through them in your own time to get deeper context. Now, to add more context to the question of what Daniel's asking, what do I think personally, right? And this is what I'm going to say first and foremost. So Daniel kind of mentioned, and this kind of gets to just modern day, we're Christians, right? Obviously all of this stuff was under the Old Testament, under the Old Covenant, basically for Israel and anyone who basically adopted Israel's practices. But what about us as Christians today, living in the 21st century currently, and looking at what it says in the Bible, looking at God's view on these kind of things in the Bible, and now being ultimately a Christian, modern day Christian today, right? So do I believe we're under major usury, and what do I think about it? Well, this is the thing, right? my view on this particular topic, first and foremost, is I feel and I believe, I wouldn't necessarily agree with everything that jdaniel says or presented. One thing I will say is we have a choice, right? For the majority of us, especially living in the Western world, we have a choice whether we decide to engage in being under, because he referenced heavy levies, basically heavy interest. In many cases, we have an opportunity to decide and say, you know what, I'm not going to subject myself into those scenarios. But there are other times when you may be so, things may be so bleak, you may be so destitute that you just say, you know what, I need to kind of sell myself in whatever way it is in regards to basically like paying the debt. And I don't mean that in like a derogatory term or anything like that. I'm just talking about, you may now need to, let's say for example, take out a loan, credit cards, etc., 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 right? So I don't think we're in a position, even where there's high leverage stuff going on, where we do not have a choice. I believe we do have a choice in many ways. And someone, I thought about this, is a good example, is very popular today, is a guy like Dave Ramsey. Most people know who Dave Ramsey is, especially if you've been interested in any sort of finance. Why do I bring him up? Because a couple of reasons. He's heavy on what would be referenced in scripture time as no usury, right? Don't go into any sort of debt. Don't be in needing to pay interest to anyone else. Now, the second reason I bring him up is not just because he's very against the debt, against usury, right? The second reason I brought him up is because he's a professing Christian, right? He's a professing evangelical Christian today, and he holds these principles. So because of that, right? Randall asks who is he? Dave Ramsey is a very popular, people would say a financial expert. I'll just put it like that. Very popular American, and he's a professing Christian. So watching people like Dave Ramsey and similar people like that are prime examples, whether you're young or old, of how even in like major oppression, if you want to call it that, even in a scenario where you can be enticed into going into major like debt, etc., he's someone who's basically waving the flag, right, and saying, look, don't go into debt, get out of debt as quickly as possible, etc., and do something completely different. So that's my view. Even in a scenario where we may be in major interest, major usury, high debt, all these different kind of things, scenarios, we still have a choice in many cases. Now, to wrap up this question, I want to give you some final thoughts, which I think are really interesting and really significant. The first thing I want to highlight is, this is for those who are truly struggling, right? I know a lot of what I said is really general, right? In regards to, you have choices, all these different kind of things, but there are situations, single mums, for example, who are working round the clock for whatever reason. They don't have a husband in the house to basically carry the load with them or lessen some of the load. A scenario like that, which is not ideal, right? Clearly not by God's standards. That's not an ideal scenario. For people in those kind of scenarios, working around the clock, and it doesn't have to just be women either, right? Men can be like very destitute as well. So this, I don't think, is going to be the majority. This will be more so, if it's not the majority, more so be a minority, right? Of people who may be using all of the financial principles that maybe someone like Dave Ramsey or someone else may say, looking at biblical principles to basically get out of debt and poverty, all those kind of things, and is still very like struggling heavily. In a scenario like that, what I would personally advise, if you're struggling in that kind of scenario, like really, really struggling, like this isn't just, you're not applying yourself or anything along those lines, I would say go and find Bible-believing churches, right? A Bible-believing congregation, assembly of Christians, and basically seek help. And by God's grace, those kind of people who are trying to live biblically will do very similar to what we kind of looked at in regards to the Old Testament scriptures, and help you till you can get to a position where you can like be stable enough to basically manage on your own. The reason I brought that up as well is because I want to give you an example ultimately, and I can refer to the book of Acts. I mentioned this in previous times, right? And I'll show you this very quickly. The reason I'm saying that someone really, really struggling should go to a church is because what do we see? We see examples in the early church. This is now New Testament period, where it's not necessarily, one would say, talking about interest and all these different kind of things, but read this in your own time as well. This is an example of where believers were banding together, and what does it say? They had all things, what? Common, right? Everything was common among them. And when you find people like this that are really like after God's own heart, as New Testament believers, interested like seriously in the scripture, right? People band together and things get better. And this is the key part right here as well. Neither was there any among them that lacked, right? So I think a scripture like this in conjunction to what we've kind of talked about, I think a scripture like this in conjunction to what we've talked about in regards to usury is very significant, because it highlights Old Testament kind of principles. God didn't want his people basically trying to take advantage in any way, like progressing off the back of your brother or your sister. And as Christians, we have the same mandate, maybe just in a different scenario, where it's like, look, you see someone struggling, and as from a Christian perspective, it's almost like the onus is even on us even more to branch out and help those in need, right? So if you see someone in need, obviously being Christ-like would be to help them. So if you are struggling in that kind of scenario, that would be my suggestion. And ultimately that scenario, those kind of scenarios that you can read about in the early chapters in the book of Acts, is really powerful. Another thing I'll give you as a final thought is, do not fall into this trap or even go deeper, right? Some people say, you know what, I mentioned Dave Ramsey before, right? Some people just strictly stay away from all types of interest. They won't go into debt. And even if they lend money to someone, it's not to say, some people will just go as far as saying, or I'll put it like this, even if they lend money to people or lend things to people, they may lend it to them not with the intention to, you know what, you need to give it back to me plus interest. That's one thing. But also, secondly, if you're already in these scenarios, let's say, for example, you're in heavy debt, I wouldn't advise you to try and go deeper into debt. I'd be trying to advise you to come out of it quicker. You've got scripture like Proverbs 6, read that in your own time. We won't allude to it, or we don't go there now at this particular time. It talks about getting out of debt as quickly as possible, right? Like an animal that's basically running away from a prey that's basically a predator that's trying to kill it, right? The final thing I'll highlight in regards to final thoughts, which I think is quite significant, is ultimately, this is a key and like categorical sign in regards to the battle between what? Looking at others, right? And being enticed by what other people have, and being able to live within your means and the income that you actually possess. This is how this whole interest, going into debt, all of this, and the reason I've focused more so on going into debt is because that is the most likely the problem that most people are actually facing. Being in a position where they are actually subject to the borrower, right? Just to use the Old Testament reference. So think about it from this perspective. I would say one of the big reasons this happens heavily is because a lot of us look at what other people have. We're looking at loads of advertisements. We're looking at all of these different things. This is one of the reasons, a key sign of the end times, right? I did a video a couple of days ago. I'll leave that in the description box as well, talking about this. We've gone through multiple different phases in the last 10 to 20 years, which have got us into a position where we're so focused on other people and what other people have. Those are some of the factors which make us think, you know what, I need a new car or I need a new house, when you really don't. But the decision to go forward in that regard will ultimately put you in a position where you ultimately need to spend more than you actually are bringing in. So in a scenario like that, I would just say, look, think about this. This is a battle. There's a reason. And if the scripture says it in the Old Testament, right? The borrower is subject to the lender. That's a biblical principle. So there's many people out there that are saying, look, I want to borrow to people, right? Or I want to lend to people, sorry, so they can be subject to me. So if you think about it from that perspective, the next time you're seeing advertisements for certain things, you have to think to yourself, look, Like, this isn't necessarily essential. Let me give you an example, right? This is a device, right? This isn't about, obviously, I'm gonna say this, like, this isn't sponsored, just for the record, right? I feel like I have to say that. This is a device. We don't even need to say what brand it is, but most people know what this is, right? This device, this brand came out with a new device recent days, right? They're on number 12, whatever. This is number 6, right? So I'm 6 generations behind. And you know what? I don't care. Why? Because at the end of the day, what is this device supposed to do? Pick up and give calls, and smartphones, as they say, pretty much do exactly the same with this phone opposed to a phone that's just coming out now. Yes, there's little things, or some people say big things, but nothing to the essential nature of the device, right? The original nature of the device was to receive and give and to output calls. It can do that. It can do other things, etc. So many people will say, look, I'm going deeper and deeper and deeper into this subjection to not even the company per se, but to your provider, right? And hopefully that's an example of how some people will say, look, I'm not falling into that trap or going deeper into the trap. I'm going to make decisions on my own finances, and I could buy a better phone or a more later phone, but is it essential? The way I kind of go, just to give you more context, is I like to buy when I feel there's been a huge shift. And if there's definitely not a huge shift every year. So hopefully those points basically make sense for anyone who's basically watching this video. And let me now open it up, right, to any new potential questions, Bible related. Feel free to put them in the chat section. Hopefully that was sufficient for jdaniel and for anyone else that may be interested. Maybe I'll post this as a standalone video, touch it up a little bit, and then basically publish it. But hopefully that helps. Let's see. Let's see. jdaniel says, to add, I guess, some context, he says, this is often used as justification for charging Christians usury. And I guess I didn't mention this either. Another thing which is significant, right? And I mentioned it, but I'll add this part in. So obviously in the Old Testament, it was don't do it to your brother. You can do it to someone else, right? Someone who's not under the same laws as you. But the fact of the matter is, this is license, what some people will use as license to say, look, you are not under my legal confines. You obey a different law. I can now exact from you. And some people do that, right? I would look at how God views it in the Old Testament, right? And if God views it like this, if there's a group of people and they say, for example, we are not Christians, so because we are not Christians, we have no problem exacting interest on Christians. This kind of goes back to the point I was making about being, even if there are heavy ramifications, heavy interest trying to be levied. This is why I brought up someone like Dave Ramsey, because he's going to try and give you advice and say, look, these are the kind of things which you should do in order to kind of get out of these kind of scenarios. So whether people do it or not doesn't justify someone going deeper and deeper and deeper in many cases, because many people have just gone into the habit of consumerism, right? And we've all been affected, especially the younger we are. In many cases, we can be even more influenced because we've been brought up even like within this kind of setting without like knowing anything different. Someone who hasn't been brought up in this last 10, 20, 30 years where everything's just exploded and it's technological and gadget, upgrade. They remember other times in many cases, but us that have basically been raised or are being born into this kind of scenario, we're more susceptible to those kind of things. So hopefully the add-on helps. Let's see. jdaniel says, but we don't have a choice. The World Bank, the MF global interest rates and global lending. This isn't simply a local bank issue. There is a global issue. The poorest people are the poorest due to these World Bank interests. And again, that's debatable, right? I'm not saying that things may not be, and this isn't just for a Christian either, this is for everyone, right? Because these global entities, these financial institutions, private scenarios, they're inflicting laws that's, as jdaniel says, affecting the whole world, right? Now, what you do in that scenario is completely different from someone else, right? Again, I've mentioned Dave Ramsey. There's a lot of financial principles in the Bible that can help us manage and navigate through the situation, right? At the end of the day, there are going to be situations where we may be oppressed, right? And people may be oppressed as a whole. But if it was like, not everyone is like the poorest of the poorest. And this is where I'm saying, and I said, you have to differentiate, because there are many people that are poor and struggling because they're just financially illiterate, as they say, right, in the financial sector. And just to kind of simplify that for everyone, there's people who just don't know how to manage money, and they need to learn how to manage money. They need to learn how to manage income, etc. I believe a huge percentage of people that are struggling probably fall under that category, and could probably, if everything was wiped out and they had the information, they could live respectable lifestyle. But yes, there are people that are, yes, they're struggling. These laws, whatever they are, in different settings, are too stringent and are too oppressive on them. In those scenarios, like I said, I would say go and find biblical, accepting, biblically based Christians and basically seek out help. Those are the kind of scenarios to help them basically get on their feet and do their best going forward to basically not fall back into these particular kind of scenarios. Let's see. Ecosmith gives a good example. He says you can move to somewhere where they don't do interest, which is another thing. All right. And that's powerful, because this goes to the point, right? Some people are just like, look, as they say, I want my cake and I want to eat it. Some people, and this goes back to the point, some people are not well off enough to live in certain countries, to live in certain, let's say, for example, America, like a certain state or a certain part of the country, or in the UK or in Europe. And what do? You have certain people, and they used to do this in biblical times. If there's a famine, what do? What do? They don't stay in where the famine is. In many cases, if they can, impossible, they move somewhere else, right? We see this in the book of Ruth. We see we see this in 2 Kings. We see this in different times when there's a famine. We see this in Genesis. Abraham, for example, there was a famine. He now went to somewhere else. But we are very stationary today, and because of that, we want to stay here and we're not interested in moving. Whereas in previous times, if there's a lot of struggle, we'll go somewhere else, right? So that's a good example. Thanks to Ecosmith for that. Let's see. And then jdaniel says it's owned by one single family. To be honest, whether that's true or not, it doesn't change the scenario. We're not living in anything new, right? Things may be different. They may be different strokes of the same kind of thing, but these kind of scenarios are nothing new throughout world history, right? The key is to learn new strategies, new ways, or to learn ways that people have used to basically get out of the situation, or to make things as good or as better for them as possible. Let's see. jdaniel says that there is no place on earth without usury. That's not true, right? These are things you have to obviously search and look into and see. At least if let's say, for example, you're right. It doesn't mean that everywhere's going to be to the same extremities. And that kind of goes back to the point Ecosmith was making about moving, right? Let's see. Ecosmith gives another example, and this is, we talked about the scriptural example, but again, let's look at practical. She talks about, look, the Jews do this, Islamists, Muslims do this as well, right? The Jews, which is a powerful concept, and anything God's doing, God isn't gonna tell his people to do things for a joke, ladies and gentlemen. I know people get oh, it's the Old Testament, oh, it's the law. This is one of those really significant wise things God actually said, which many people don't read, because they just think, forget it. Like, it's even in the New Testament, right? I looked at Acts, right? And think about it. Imagine if, as a group of people, you're all working together, banding together, trying to rise, right? This is where the kind of things that Daniel's presenting get weaker and weaker and weaker. Why? Because one person can do what? But two people can do what? Right? Let alone you now start bringing more people together. I reference a single mum, right? A single mum or a single household, whether you're a single mum or a single dad, adding a partner to that situation, i.e. a wife, a husband, right? What God desires. Now it's a little bit easier, if not more exponentially easier, to basically move forward. Now you think about one married couple, two married couples, and they're working together. Now it's even a little bit easier. 3, 4, 5, right? A whole church, for example, worth of families working together. This is why that early church in Acts was very powerful. And again, going back to the things I've talked about so far, the world we live in today is very me centered. And because it's very me centered, think about the example in Nehemiah, right? Many people would never, all right? Let's say, for example, that someone owes you money and then you've got a great deal, right? You got a great deal. You got high interest payments for them to give you back, etc. In Nehemiah, what did they have? They had lands, they had goods, they had loads of stuff of these people, and they relinquished it. But many people would not relinquish it. Why? Because that serves the individual. Whereas God is telling us to do the complete opposite, from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Like, team up and work together. Because when you team up, now organizations that may be trying to oppress you or may just be trying to focus on their own growth, right? It's harder for those people to leverage you. And the Jews do this very tactically, and so do the Muslims, right? This is something very commendable, that you have to commend the Jews and also Muslims for doing this, because they understand. I'm not going to get into why, but maybe for another day, or for someone else on another channel can discuss those things, right? But it shows unity. And we have examples of it in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And if Christians, more of us did it, things would be even better, right? Let's see. Let's see. Ecosmos asks question: what do you think of this CV vaccine and the technology it's carrying? If mandatory, do you think it could be the mark? Okay, so what I'd say in regards to that is, I feel the way I kind of believe the mark to be, I believe that it is going to be something forced upon you, as the scripture says in Revelation. I do kind of feel we will know, right? For those of us still living at that time, it will not be like a trick, as in, oh, you took the mark of the beast because you were duped into it or you're tricked. You are going to make the decision to take the mark of the beast. Now, full disclosure, I don't like spend a lot of time into all of these different kind of things, like all of this. So I don't know the ins and outs of the technology that is presented. However, just to kind of keep this very simple, if it's a situation where it becomes mandatory, right, that is a feature, based on how I view the mark of the beast, which is prevalent, right? That's one of the key signs. It becomes mandatory. You cannot buy or sell unless you have the mark, right? As in Revelation. So if it came out and they said, look, this vaccine, whatever it is, right, you need to take it, it's mandatory. At the end of the day, whenever someone's basically trying to impose something, we always have a decision, right? We always have a choice. Even going back to the usury question, right? I said this as well. We have a choice. I don't think, like, unless it's like a straight slavery position, not indentured like slavery in the sense that you've sold yourself to work off your debt. I'm talking about an oppressive, we captured you and you are serving by force. Even in those kind of scenarios, you have a choice, but it's less of a choice ultimately. Now your life may be on the line, etc. But in a scenario where it becomes compulsory and they're like, look, you have to do it, it's a clear sign. Like, I don't know if, like, I'll put it like this, it potentially could be, right? If they come out and say, look, it's straight, whatever. I've heard stuff about it going in the right hand and or in the forehead and these different kind of things. And I've heard people say, well, that is the most like opportune like place to basically insert things into your body, right? Whether people want to say that's a coincidence or not, but I would think that it would be a sign. It could be, it could not be, but there are other things that go into it as well ultimately. So it wouldn't just be compulsory that would make me think, yeah, this is it. Let's see. jdaniel says, great research and thank you. Thanks for asking the question. Ikazmir says, there is nothing she wants so much she's willing to go into debt for. Quoting Dave Ramsey, right? Because you'll be enslaved to the lender ultimately, right? Let's see. And jdaniel's talking about just different potential side effects. And this is the thing, right? I'm not, like I said, I don't spend a lot of time focusing on these kind of things, right? At the end of the day, I've got my own views on what's going on. I don't, if you haven't noticed, I try to focus more so. And again, live Q&A, ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't got a question, if you've got a question, feel free to put it in. If not, I guess it'll be an early night, right? For me. But one thing I'll say is I don't spend a lot of time listening and watching like news. I'll put it like that. Everyone's presenting something, right? Like you come to a live stream, I'm presenting something. So it's not like I'm against people presenting or presenting what they believe to be true, or maybe some people present what they know is a lie, right? But I like to look at facts, right? And looking at the facts, at least in the country I'm living in right now, right? Or the region I'm living in, right? In the UK, I like to look at the numbers. What do the numbers say? Because numbers, they say numbers never lie, but my view is numbers may never lie, but numbers don't always give you the context of the numbers, right? So, but I like to look at numbers, like what's going on, how many people are, what's the word, involved, like how many people recovered, etc. I like to look at all these different numbers and then try and make an informed decision, right? I say this all the time in regards to Bible. I try to be like this a lot of ways. Context, right? Context. I want to see the context of all these different like facts that are being presented and see. And what you see in the mainstream is clearly different to what you see in regards to the context of the figures that are actually being released. So from that perspective, I wouldn't necessarily be that excited into doing certain things or not doing certain things. But again, like I said, when it comes to compulsory or compulsion, what kind of compulsion as well? Is it, if you don't do this, then you can't go to a particular place, right? Is this, if you don't do this, you're going to prison? Or is it, if you do not do this, off with your head, right? And then maybe, I guess I should have brought that up in regards to what Ecos Mills was asking, because there's different types, there's different levels to compulsion. If let's say globally, or like in the UK, for example, they said, you know what, this is now compulsory. If you now want to be able to move freely through certain places, but if you don't take it, you have to continue wearing a face mask, etc. Right? It's compulsory in one sense, but it's also not compulsory in another sense. And I know many people just be like, okay, well, they're just going to wear the face mask. Others are going to be like, no, the face mask is so irritating, or whatever they're using, a visor or etc. They are going to do something completely different. They'll just basically take it and then basically walk out free, right? My brother was telling me about something yesterday, or I guess a couple of days ago, yesterday, and he was basically saying someone was telling him that the person that was telling him the story overheard a woman saying she can't wait for the thing to come out so she can basically take it and just basically go back to normal. So there's people that are just like, look, they're going to do whatever it takes. And this is even life or death. But it's an example ultimately of just being ready, regardless, to stick to your morals, to your convictions, and the things that you believe in, right? jdaniel asked, staying kind of on topic, what do you think about Paul in relation to servitude? What do you mean specifically? Like Paul, I think Paul kind of like lines. I think Paul, I'll put it like this. Let's look at an example, right? Well, I'll put it like this. I believe Paul is very practical, right? I believe the Holy Spirit is used Paul, and not just Paul, and I'll bring that up in a moment, to be very practical with the situation, right? So Paul gives, I guess if this is what jdaniel is talking about, like rules in regards to servitude, he gives examples of how slaves should be with their masters, right? How masters should be with their slaves, etc. And some people look at that and say, well, Paul is just like, why didn't Paul just like, or anyone in the New Testament, for example, outright abolish slavery and say, look, don't do it, right? Like in those exact words. And jdaniel says, yes, I got it. Now, the thing that people don't consider is Christianity, like at the time of the New Testament writings, was not like the world power, right? So let's say, for example, and Jesus is a prime example of this. This gives you a good example, right? So if you study the Gospels, you'll see Jesus was very wise and smart, right? Some will say cunning, however you want to describe it. He was very wise with the words he used, right? Why? Because he obviously had subjected himself to be a first century Jewish man under Roman governance. So if the Romans, for example, said slavery is fine, and let's say, for example, Jesus or someone came along and said, like, forget about it, and that was the message being preached out, you're now obviously putting many people's lives in potential danger, because now you're going against what the world rulership is actually saying. So Paul, I believe, is the overall message. The way I kind of put it is this: the overall message in the New Testament is not to do those kind of things, right? If you read the scripture in that regard, it's like, and I've mentioned this previously, right, in regards to the usury, right? In regards to someone that's struggling today as a Christian, go and find biblically based people. Why? Why did I say that? Because a Christian that reads the Bible, right, and really is truly getting the message, would help someone in need. And in the same sense, it's like, let's say, for example, if you had a slave, for example, as a Christian, if you were in that situation, how would you treat, like, let's say, for example, Christians go like, and I know this is, people get really excited and like really angry if we go back to, let's say, for example, 300-400 years, right, to when it was heavy in America and in other places as well. Some of it still goes on today. And people misuse the Bible to basically initiate or continue certain situations. But someone truly reading the Bible would not have gone down those lines. So again, Paul is basically just giving insights in Ephesians, in Corinthians. Peter, in his epistle, talks about it as well, right? About suffering or being under servitude. And what do they all highlight? They're all basically highlighting that even in a struggling situation, right? Like, it's not comparable to what Christ went through for us. And also, it's like, this is all temporal, right? People may go through certain things now, but then at the same time, like, we're going to somewhere better. Now, to be a bit more specific in regards to the whole servant master kind of situation, a lot of the scenarios really are not as we have it in our minds today, where it's this heavy oppressive thing. And again, just going back to what I said before about being from a Christian perspective, even if you were under these scenarios, you wouldn't necessarily be treating your people, right, if you want to call them slaves, servants, whatever, the way other people would be. right? If they're going to be doing extremely oppressive stuff, especially if you like a biblically based Christian wouldn't be doing that. I'll just put it like that, right? So another thing to think about in regards to this as well is the New Testament paints a picture as if, look, even in hard situations, you can be someone who can change someone else, right? So let's say, for example, you're a slave and your master, for example, in that kind of scenario, like the worst of the worst kind of slavery, your master is an unbeliever. Like, no one's saying like it or enjoy it, but that is still an example of a scenario where you can actually help potentially convert someone, right? And I mentioned Peter before. Peter says this nice and clearly, because when we suffer, we're suffering like it's worthy. We might as well suffer for Christ's sake opposed to suffering for just anything else, right? And in those kind of scenarios, that's a testimony. That's an evangelism mechanism. So hopefully that helps, right? Let's see. jdaniel says, staying on topic of usury / servitude, he thinks they are basically related. Curious on my opinions of cryptos. He thinks it's a very interesting topic and hasn't heard a religious perspective. That's a good question. It's funny because someone asked me about this today, right? Not necessarily from a Christian perspective, but I was asking me about cryptos. Personally, I'm not into it. Like, I'm not into it is the best way to kind of put it. Especially for those that are interested in doing it on like a short-term kind of basis. If you ever going, in my opinion, if you're ever going to do any of those kind of things, I'd say you do it from a more long-term perspective. But there are waves, there are bubbles, as they say. Things come, things go. Things come, things go. And many people kind of get duped into even good scenarios. People can get duped with the allure of basically trying to get rich quick, as they say. So I'm not a really like big fan of just the quick stuff, right? I'm more so like the patient kind of person. If you're going to do that kind of stuff, that's what I'd advise. But again, this goes back to what I was talking about before about the news. A lot of the stuff you hear mainstream wise, you have to think about, why are they saying this? Why is this stuff coming out? Is this for my benefit or is this for my detriment, etc.? Let's see. Let's see. And they then says it's important that we learn about the tech before it rules us. And he says all currency is already digital. And yeah, to a certain degree, like obviously cash hasn't been completely done away with yet. But clearly, even from 20 years ago, you can see the push towards digital stuff. And let me put it like this. When I'm saying I'm not like the biggest fan of, like, I guess, you know what, let me go back a little bit, because I kind of answered the question in this way. When I answered for cryptos, in my mind, I was thinking of the most popular one, right? Bitcoin. So I was kind of answering in that, guys. But what I would say is, I can understand how something like a cryptocurrency, because cryptocurrency is obviously more than Bitcoin. So I can understand how crypto's digital currency is the next step in regards to going from cash, coins, to paper, to debit cards, credit cards, going to just something completely digital, right? Ultimately, as technology is increasing, that's ultimately where they're trying to basically take us to. So yeah, it's interesting ultimately, right? And he says cash is not backed by physical asset, and that's true. And cash for a long time hasn't really been backed. Some people say it is, but really, if you go into really deep detail, it's not backed in, especially in the way it was originally, ultimately. So let's see. Yeah, and jdaniel says obviously the whole crypto thing is supposed to be public and for the person, and it can't be basically manipulated and stuff like that. And I guess some people debate it, right? Some people say the whole cryptocurrency formula and that kind of stuff is very watertight, locked in and sealed. But anything, in my opinion, that can be made can be manipulated in one way or another, right? Even the most sophisticated creations. So again, this all goes into the people and their agendas and why it's obviously a good marketing perspective. It's a good marketing ploy to basically say, look, yeah, you know what, this is unhackable, right? Because that can lure a lot of people in. But can anyone truly say any system or software that's actually made, right, be unhackable, etc., right? jdaniel says he doesn't like Paul's perspective on servitude. Why not? Right? I know some people don't. They think like Paul should have done more, and even like that premise, right? And I kind of alluded to it already. It's like Paul isn't the only one that references this. This is why when I hear people make those kind of statements, like you have to consider the fact that Paul just lined up with Peter, like the rest of the disciples, right? They were all very similar in what they said, because it's not an easy message for many people, right? I believe in a lot of ways, like this is more of a spiritual kind of mindset. If you say to someone, look, even if you're suffering, like, yes, it's bad physically, but don't worry, like there's something bigger and better, like keep going, right? Like a lot of people don't want to hear that. And it takes a lot of like spiritual grounding to kind of see what's actually going on, especially when you liken it to Christ. Because when you start, like, I always like to put Christ on the other side of it when we're thinking about these kind of things, because when you put Christ there, it's like, oh, okay, now it makes sense. So Christ came and was our servant in that regard. He suffered unjustly. So yes, we may suffer unjustly in certain scenarios, but we can overcome because Christ has given us the example, right? So even in like really tough situations, they're not situations which determines and says, look, oh, because this situation's so bad, you have to lose your faith, right? We've got examples. We've got that great cloud of witness of different scenarios of people going through serious stuff. So let's see. Jaden says, but he's not attacking Paul specifically, but he has the clearest perspective. To be clear, I guess going by numbers, he should, because he wrote the majority, right? So just by mere volume, he is most likely going to be the one that covers a topic more so than others. Let's see. Not attacking Paul, but too many Christians today are happy to be slaves, and in his eyes, too many who don't respect research usury, too many who don't understand the systems we live in. And yeah, like ultimately, let's see. Ultimately, the black, this all comes back to knowledge. Ultimately, right? People love to quote Hosea, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." And although it may not contextually apply to us today, the principle definitely still applies, right? You read a lot of Proverbs and you see that same kind of concept. People are destroyed, people die because of lack of knowledge. So it's our jobs, right, as Christians who are in the know, to do what? To basically educate. This is something I've talked about a lot this year, over and over again. Myself personally feeling convicted over and over again about different things. Why? Because I feel like we have a lot of stuff that like we can share, right? But many of us choose not to. So from that perspective, it's almost like you've got information, you've got food to give to someone else, but you don't necessarily do it, or you reserve it, which is the complete opposite of, especially what we talked about today in regards to usury, right? And in regards to interest and stuff like that. You see your brother struggling, like help them. And like, even before we get into stuff like currencies and all these different kind of things, there's more practical things before we get into those things that not only Christians, the world has to basically begin to embrace. Because if you don't embrace them, then it's like you are going to struggle. And this is what I was saying before, earlier on, about some people are struggling, but they don't need to struggle. They just need a bit more financial education to learn more about what's actually going on. Like simple stuff that many people, you may understand. Some people don't understand the theory, right? Some people don't understand that you should spend less than you make. It's a very simple concept, but a lot of people don't understand it, right? But imagine just a simple concept like that can help many, many people. Many people are over leveraged, right? So before you even get into like tech stuff and all these different kind of things, there's just basic stuff that many of us do not know. And a lot of this just is seeds, like generational. The former generation didn't know, so they didn't teach to the next generation. The next generation didn't know, so they didn't teach it to the next generation, etc. Right? Now, so if you can go back from that perspective, like it's serious. It's a serious situation, ladies and gentlemen. Well, as it stands, I'll probably call it a stream here, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I know there was technical difficulties that kind of derailed us for our season, but God is obviously ultimately glorified, and God will bring glory from different situations, even when it may seem like no glory will actually come from it. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Hopefully I'll see all of you sometime soon. Look out for the next video or the next live stream we post at some point in the future. Thanks and take care, and I'll see you sometime soon.